All right, I think it's about time for us to get underway. So thank you for those of you who have been able to join us this evening. I'd like to introduce you to myself. My name is Brett McAllister. I'm one of the assistant directors of graduate admissions here for the Halmos College of Arts and Sciences. I'm, one of the people that is in charge of the conflict resolution program, so I get to work firsthand with Dr. Judith McKay, who is our faculty member, who is also joining us this evening as well, as my coworker, Mr. Teddy Uwe. We will see as well. He's one of our graduate people as well. He's fantastic. And this evening, we are getting to listen to hopefully soon to be Dr. Jacqueline Ennis will be advising us this evening. Jacqueline is a doctoral student for us here with the Department of Conflict Resolution Studies at Nova Southeastern University. She already does hold a master's degree from our conflict resolution studies as well here at NSU. She's been working in a variety of senior level research and research administration positions during her career. She was an assistant commissioner for the research and evaluation for the state of mental health departments in both two states of Oklahoma and Virginia. She has also established, and chaired the Outcome Research Program at MedStar Health Research Institute. Jacqueline is passionate about her research for social justice and a strong proponent for scholarship of engagement. So with that being said, thank you once again, Jacqueline, for taking some time and speaking to our potential students as well as other faculty members and myself. So I'm going to turn the floor over to you, Jacqueline, and take it away from there.
Thank you very much, Brett. Appreciate the opportunity to be here this evening with everybody. I have a few slides that I'll talk to you about adverse childhood experiences, and what I hope to do is give a background on adverse childhood experiences, and then talk a little bit about where I see, in my very humble opinion, opportunities that are being missed in the way that adverse childhood experiences are being addressed, both from a research and a practice perspective. So a little bit, and I do hope, before I go on, I do hope that at the end of my presentation that we do have an opportunity for dialogue. I'd be really excited about hearing thoughts of others that are on this call. So I'll leave a good amount of time at the end for feedback and discussion. So thank you very much. So with that being said, what is adverse childhood experiences? What is ACE? Back in 1995, between 1995 and 1997, Kaiser Permanente Research Institute, under a grant with the Center for Disease Control, undertook a series of studies that looked at the relationship of a number of experiences during developmental stages, a child's developmental stages, between the ages of 0 and 17, and how those experiences impacted life's course, both in terms of socioeconomic, health, and educational outcomes. And over a 2-year period of time, using their massive database that they had, they followed quite a number of people, connecting the self-reported experiences of childhood with the life course outcome. And they found a very strong relationship between what was then called and what is now termed ACE, or adverse childhood experiences. They found a strong relationship between those experiences and the outcomes, life's outcomes, as a person gets into adulthood. So the adverse childhood experiences fall into 3 categories: abuse, that's physical abuse, emotional abuse, and sexual abuse. Physical neglect and emotional neglect, and then experiences within the household or those experiences that a child has contact with. So mental illness in a parent or a relative that lives in the household, divorce, incarceration of one or both of the parents, substance use, substance abuse within the household, and also seeing a parent being treated, abused, and visualizing constant violence within in the household. What they found, though, what's interesting about adverse childhood experiences is that one would think that this doesn't happen to everybody. It's an inner city thing. It's a big city thing, but it's not. What they found is 61% of the entire U.S. population of adults has experienced at least one adverse childhood experience. 1 in 6 adults have experienced 4 or more adverse childhood experiences. Now, with that being said, the ACE is predominant among females, among non-Hispanic Native Americans, and among non-Hispanic African Americans or Black. Besides the obvious, why is adverse childhood experiences important? It's because they found, and there is just a tremendous amount of research that shows that with the adverse childhood experiences, there are risks of poor health outcomes, and those include things like depression, obesity, cardiovascular disease, cancer, and it also leads to poor health risk behaviors, such as smoking, drinking, alcoholism, substance abuse, and it also impacts socioeconomic standing that is directly related to education or lack thereof, unemployment or inconsistent employment. So it's all interrelated. They're finding if you have poor health, you can't hold a job. All of those types of things are all interrelated, and they all track back to or a sequelae of the adverse childhood experiences. One of the more recent things that we've found about adverse childhood experiences is that it's intergenerational, which makes it even more difficult to address. And what we mean by intergenerational is that a child or an individual who experiences adverse childhood experience will also have children who also have adverse childhood experiences. And adults who have adverse childhood experiences and then have poor health outcomes will also have children with poor health outcomes that are experiencing adverse childhood experiences. So it's very, very cyclical. It's very, very dominant. And as you can imagine, it's hard to break out of. There is hope when you're looking at adverse childhood experiences. There's been a lot of research that shows where adverse childhood experiences can be prevented, there is marked decreases in the poor health outcomes. So, for example, the preventive measures taken in ACE can result in as much as a 44% reduction in depression, 26% reduction in COPD, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, 24% reduction in heavy drinking and alcoholism, 13% reduction in cardiovascular disease. These are just from preventive efforts. But as I said, with it becoming more widespread, or now that we're seeing that it's an intergenerational issue, you can imagine that the preventive efforts are becoming, one, much more important, but also much more difficult for prevention alone to have an impact on adverse childhood experiences. One of the things that coming out of the research on ACE as well is the fact that the adverse childhood experiences and what we experience as individuals is not experienced in isolation. It's part of a human ecology that includes our direct relationships, our relationships with a broader community, which includes significant others that are not directly related to you, and our interaction indirectly and directly with society as a whole. This model comes from a theory by Yuri Bronfenbrenner, and this particular model that's on your screen right now is an abbreviated version of it. But basically, it says that we don't live in isolation and we are impacted by a broader social ecology. And some believe, including the CDC and many of the researchers that are looking at adverse childhood experiences, many believe that you cannot look at and you cannot consider adverse childhood experiences without considering a broader impact of how the community affects those adverse childhood experiences. And because of this, there's been a lot more research being done on community trauma and what amounts to adverse community experiences. Now, community level, the importance of community level trauma is that where you have a healthy community, you have people that can thrive and really fulfill their life's dreams and wishes, etc. That's the ideal. But what we do know and what we have seen is that in a community where there is adverse impacts within the community, such as violence, poverty, and the like, those conditions build on the conditions within the home that make up adverse childhood experiences. And so what we found in the research is that it's not just the traumatic event in the community that adds on to the adverse childhood experiences. It's the fact that the community has difficulty recovering from its own trauma. And the extent to which the community can't recover from its own trauma makes it even more difficult for individuals who have their own struggles through adverse childhood experiences. It makes it even more difficult for them to lift themselves out of that individual level trauma. So it's almost like a compounding effect of adverse childhood experiences and adverse community environments that work together to bring people down. And this is this is what's called, and if you read at all on adverse childhood experiences, you'll hear of the pair of ACEs. And I really love this tree as a metaphor because it really speaks to how adverse childhood experiences are rooted in, and that's the metaphor of the tree. The adverse childhood experiences are rooted in adverse community environments. So where there is poverty and discrimination, poor opportunities, violence, all of those are the roots of things that happen within the home. Violence in the home, homelessness, mental illness, physical and emotional neglect, etc. So there's a lot of research now that is suggesting that you cannot uncouple adverse childhood experiences from adverse community environments. So as we think about adverse community environments and community trauma, and those terms are used interchangeably, we look at the concept of structural violence. Those systemic conditions that pose harm to individuals in the community and prevent them from achieving their full potential. And it's really the issue of structural violence that got me to think a lot about adverse childhood experiences and the way that adverse childhood experiences are being studied and being addressed. So the structural violence includes, and I'm going to zero in on the one thing that caused me to begin to think about this, is gentrification and displacement. And I'll tell you where it came from. I live in the Washington, D.C. area. I've lived in this area for about 25 years. And there are sections for those of you who've not been in Washington, D.C., there are some very, very beautiful sections of Washington, near Capitol Hill, et cetera, well-appointed sections of Capitol Hill, of Washington, D.C., and you literally could walk 10 minutes and to be in one of the most depressing, impoverished areas of the nation's capital that include poor housing, unemployment, terrible violence, homelessness, etc. And that is within eyeshot of the nation, of the Capitol, of the White House, etc. Well, what's been happening over the last few years in Washington, D.C. is gentrification. All of a sudden, being in D.C. is the place to be. So areas that you would not have 10 or 15 years ago, you would not have voluntarily walked through that neighborhood, are now the site of nightlife, very vibrant, new buildings, renovated buildings that were in total disrepair have been renovated, and it's almost like a completely different city. And as I drove through, I wondered, where are all the people that lived here before? Where did they go? Because certainly they can't afford to live there anymore, and they don't. Violence has gone down. The housing has changed. There are many, many more opportunities for shopping and nightlife, etc. Well, if you go about another 15 minutes further out of DC, of Washington, DC, you're in Maryland in a county called Prince George's County, suburban DC. And what's happening in Prince George's County? Used to be a pretty good county. Well, the areas that border Washington, D.C., the violence has gone up, the murder rate has gone up. Lots of people are moving out of those areas of Prince George's County. housing is deteriorating, businesses are leaving, and many of these factors that you're seeing under structural violence have moved from Washington, D.C., the areas that are building up in a positive way in D.C., it's moving and encroaching into the next geographic area. So what does this have to do with adverse childhood experiences, and adverse community environments? What made me wonder is, with all the work that's being done around adverse childhood experiences and championing community resilience and improving the community, improving community trauma, are we improving it in a way for the people who are there today and stay there, or are we improving it for a new set of people to come in and only relocating the people who needed those preventive services? And that's my question. Does gentrification and correction of structural violence only relocate people and not really address the issues that we're trying to address through prevention? And while there's a lot of research around community resilience and community prevention, I'm wondering whether, from a research and an outcome perspective, are we focusing too much on the community? And maybe arguably, there can never be too much focus on a community, but should there be more of a balance, a research and an action balance on addressing the adverse impacts of life on the individual, so that those the efforts that we make are transportable? It goes with the individual, and it does not rely on the individual staying in the same location that they're in. So that's where my interest really started, with thinking about adverse childhood experiences in a really different way. When you think about what we do as a society, as practitioners, to correct structural violence, are the results of what we do beneficial, or are we pushing people away? So I'll go back now to the presentation. This is kind of just a complex way of showing how all of the work that's being done around both community trauma and adverse childhood experiences, how those things combine to supposedly work together to improve the lives of people, the lives and the outcomes of people who experience childhood trauma and community trauma. But once again, I'll emphasize that we may not be focusing on the right level of outcomes as we implement prevention programs. One of the ways that adverse childhood experiences are measured is the prevalence, the incidence and prevalence of adverse childhood experiences is measured by every year. The behavioral risk factor survey is conducted. It's conducted by the partnership between the state departments of health and the Centers for Disease Control. And many of the states have adopted the ACE, adverse childhood experiences, questionnaire as one of the modules in their BARFIS, the Behavioral Risk Factor Survey. They've adopted the ACE module as part of the BARFIS survey. And one of the things that the states that do the ACE module, they ask the respondents if they have any of the ACE factors, if they have experienced any of the ACE factors. Well, all of the respondents are adults, and so you're looking at a point in time for adults having reported experiencing adverse childhood experience, as well as having any of the long-term health and socioeconomic outcomes of ACE. So that's the perfect purpose of having the ACE module on the risk factor survey. But the one thing that we don't know is, as they conduct those surveys on an annual basis, we don't track whether an individual has moved from one jurisdiction to another. So therein lies an opportunity for understanding how the changes that we make in a community to improve community resilience against community trauma, how those changes impact the incidence and prevalence of adverse childhood experiences. If we don't know whether a family is stable, living in the same place, or they move, we don't really know the impact of the preventive efforts that we make in a community for community trauma, leading towards community resilience. That's one kind of downside of the way that we look at it. The second question about adverse childhood experiences as it relates to how we survey for it is that where people don't move. So just say we have a community in which there are a number of people that have 4 or more of the adverse childhood experiences living in the community. How long does it take for the effect of preventive measures taken for community trauma? How long does it take for that to impact those who experience adverse childhood experiences? And so, do the preventive efforts that are made on the community level impact this intergenerational phenomenon that we're seeing with adverse childhood experiences? So I think the points that I'm trying to make here with both where we are and what we understand with adverse childhood experiences, where we are and what we understand with adverse community environments and community resilience is, it is one thing to champion and be proud of the work that's being done around prevention, to understand the positive outcomes that we have, but I would argue that we have more unanswered questions about the long-term outcome of the work that we're doing than we have answered. And I hope that as practitioners, as people interested in improving the lives of the developmental course of children and their lives after they turn adults, I hope we don't become too complacent in the small steps that we've taken, and the albeit positive, those steps that we've taken, without really understanding the fact that it has only been a drop in the bucket, and we may in fact not be meeting the needs and creating the type of impact that we would hope to create by looking at the questions of what we're doing, looking at it from a different perspective. So with that, my last slide just has the questions that really drive what my thinking is. With that, I'd like to just kind of open it up, Rich, if we could open it up for certainly willing to be my thinking to be challenged. But if anyone has questions or a different perspective, a different way of looking at it, I'd be open to that as well. I see Mason Eunice has raised his hand.
If possible, for those of you who are watching, if you wouldn't mind just typing in the chat, I'm more happy to read out the question, and that way Jacqueline can re-answer them for you then. All right, so we have a question first from Mr. Evan Hoffman. Thanks for making the presentation, Jacqueline. How could this research on ACE be applied to help prevent gun violence and school shootings?
Oh boy. That's a good question. I think you know the easy solution, and I don't want to make it sound like I'm an individual that is against gun control, because that certainly is not my answer. I think if I were to align my response on prevention of gun violence and school shootings with prevention of ACE, the common answer is that we have to focus on individuals. I think that sometimes we try to use the term boil the ocean, where it's easier to try to attack everything all at once, and with that net hope that you capture everything and fix it, when in fact that's overly simplifying things. And I think that we need to start with understanding individuals more and seeing individuals more and working from the bottom up rather than necessarily the ocean. And that's why with the adverse childhood experiences and community trauma, I favor looking more at the individual and the family and what their needs are, and having that impact the community. And the same would be true of gun violence and school shootings. At the end of the day, it comes down to the individual and the family that got to that point, albeit impacting many, many more people. So that would be my response on that.
Awesome, Evan. Thank you for that question. We do have one from Kalina Cole. Have there been any successful programs / initiatives to address community trauma?
Oh, absolutely, many, and probably the most successful, and it's being rolled out as a model across the country. It's called Building Community Resilience, and if you want to read on it, I urge you to read on Pender Hughes, who did a lot of work around that. But the model of building community resilience really looks at kind of taking a multifaceted, multi-partner approach. So there are lots of, there's no one practitioner, no one group that owns community resilience. So they think it's important to involve the schools. They think it's important to involve practitioners, that is health practitioners, pediatricians, et cetera, community leaders, empowering community leaders. So the building community resilience model has been adopted in literally hundreds of communities across the country, and it has supposedly been very, very successful. There's another model called the Thrive model, which is similar to the building community resilience model. And actually, I'm going to take this slide back a couple more. It's the Thrive model actually is the basis of the Thrive model is in this particular graphic here, and it's what Thrive stands for. As you'll see down on the bottom, the tool for health and resilience in vulnerable environments. And once again, they believe that it is a combination of community strategies with individual approaches that lead to improvements in the major areas of adverse experience, both economic opportunities, health opportunities, violence prevention, violence reduction, et cetera. So those two, I call out those two particularly because they are models that are replicated in communities across the country.
Colleen also added, is part of the individual and community healing process holding individuals or institutions responsible for the injury?
But I actually think it's both. I don't think it's a matter of necessarily of responsibility. It is definitely, obviously, structural violence is an issue of responsibility. But if you begin talking about holding responsible when it comes to individuals, the first thing that comes to people's mind is blame. And blame in and of itself is a barrier to change. It puts a wall up to effecting change from my perspective. So I prefer to say that there is a community or a societal responsibility for change, and also individual responsibility and opportunity for change. So the individuals should not be passive as it relates to changing life's course. So you can't do unto an individual. They have to be involved in that process of change. So Kalina, I think it was Kalina that asked the question. Yes, as a society, if you look at structural violence, society has a responsibility for changing or curing structural violence. But that doesn't mean that if we do away with structural violence, all good things will come to the world and we don't have anything to worry about. That's not the case.
Do you have a question from Luis Hernandez? How can we address the problem of ignorance in our society?
I think my easy answer is never giving up. That and maybe that is a Pollyannish kind of belief, but I think you start with a few, or however many there are, that believe that change can happen, and that believe that some good can come out of life, and you just keep working at it. If we were all to stand back, and now I'm putting on my my conflict resolution social justice hat, if we all stood back and said, we can't do anything because there are so many ignorant people in the world, or in the country, or in the community, then we'd never get anywhere. So all we can do is hope that we can look to the left and look to the right and change those around us, and hope that you've made the change in those around you, and they too will then pick up the mantle and look to the left and look to the right and make a change around them and get the groundswell that way. But just, we have to ignore the naysayers, ignore the ignorance, and just keep moving forward.
Awesome. And we do have one question from Mason. I know, Mason, you did reach out and ask if you don't mind speaking in person. I don't mind it, so as long as, try to keep it obviously a little brief just from the speaking standpoint. So I will just unmute you for just a quick moment while you ask your question.
Hey, thank you so much, and great presentation. I think you bring up some very interesting points. I'm going to try to make mine really quick. I think there's a problem with prevention. And the reason that I say that, just because you introduce preventative measures doesn't mean that it's not happening. It's very similar to, smoking back in the 60s and 70s. Just because they prevented it inside buildings, people still went outside. I think communities need education, and they need awareness and trauma management in a way to kind of, let these communities know where they can be helped and how to, be strengthened in many ways. Because what's happening with gentrification is the problem is just being transferred to the next city, like you said, rather than it being, fixed, with these communities being able to, buy the properties by themselves, or even fix the ACE issues through awareness and through education and through understanding, this is how I'm going to change. There's none of that. I think, like you said, there's the preventative thing where it's like, this is what we should not do. And just because, people see it on a board or, kind of go around it, it doesn't mean that it's happening in the household. And I think that's where one of the major issues is. But thank you very much. That was my question.
Thanks, Major.
All right, does anybody else have any other questions for Ms. Jacqueline? Or also, we do have Dr. Judith McKay here, as well as one of our faculty members. If you have any direct questions for any of our faculty, please feel free to ask them now while you guys are here. Colin, I apologize. I do see you have your hand raised. One, would you like to speak as well? I will allow you to speak for just a little moment as well.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Thanks, Jackie, so much. This is an awesome presentation, and I really appreciate it. I just kind of go back and ask. I know when we talked about, I asked about holding individuals or institutions accountable for harm. How would you respond if somebody says, well, how does structural violence contribute to, say, child sexual abuse? Or how does structural violence, or how is holding somebody accountable for murder, how is that blame? How would you respond to that?
Can you just either restate or rephrase the question? I think I understood the beginning part of it, but if you could just restate it one more time, please.
Sure. How would you respond if somebody said, how is structural violence, or, somebody being poor, how does that contribute to child sexual abuse? Or how does that, say, just because somebody who killed somebody came from somebody who committed murder, they came from a bad home. How do the two correlate? I guess, what is the direct connection? Is one way of asking the question, between individual harm or community harm related to socioeconomic status. So I guess that's one question. And then when you talked about when I asked about holding individuals or institutions responsible, I know you talked about it's not about blame, but people are going to want to, if you could just elaborate a little bit more on how is holding people judicially accountable, how is that blame and not personal responsibility?
Sure. I think that people, the short answer is people have to be responsible for their behavior. Okay. And socioeconomic, I think it's clear that socioeconomic status, low socioeconomic status, does not have a stranglehold or own violence, et cetera, clearly. I think that what we want to look at it in another way is that the conditions of structural violence stand as a barrier in the way of people's ability to thrive and make the best of their lives that they can. Okay? So it's not to say that structural violence causes, for example, child abuse. It is a factor that creates conditions that results in people taking actions that are a reaction to the condition. And I don't know if I'm explaining that correctly. So think about a community that is ripe with all types of structural violence, right? But in that community, the rate of child abuse and neglect it's not 100%, okay? And if you took two different communities, each with an equal amount of structural violence in their own regard, and one community has a high rate of child abuse and neglect, and the other community has a much, much lower rate of child abuse and neglect. What that says is that the adverse childhood experiences are selective responses to structural violence. And just like, I guess it's a good example that maybe chaos theory could help explain. There are so many factors that come into it that you really can't say if this then that. It just creates the air that allows something to happen. Why it doesn't happen in 100% of the people, I'm not sure that we'll ever know. And that's where some of the individualization comes. But the one thing that we do know about community trauma and structural violence, as from a broader perspective, is that it is the one thing that stands in the way of individuals and families from achieving the best and the most that they can possibly achieve. Does that answer some of your question? Is Kalina on mute?
She did respond and said that she's understood and well said.
Okay.
So we do have time for one more question, Jacqueline. I know Mason did ask, he made it a little bit smaller of a question itself in the typing of it. Said, what are your thoughts between preventative measure for ACE and trauma management?
Well, that's an interesting question, and I think that I would, given the choice, I would lean towards prevention, because trauma management suggests containing but not getting rid of. And what we want to do is be in a position of it not being there. So trauma management is just, keeping it contained, making sure it doesn't get too bad, et cetera. But prevention is looking at root causes and figuring out ways of removing that from our lives, our community, our lexicons, et cetera. And giving not only this generation, not only today's community, but tomorrow and well into the future, an opportunity for better lives, better experiences. I hope that answers Mason's question.
Awesome. Well, I want to, obviously take a minute and thank all of you for, coming to this and having such fantastic questions. I know I've obviously learned a lot personally just listening to Jacqueline speak this evening. Everything, will be posted again online for you to review. So if you do have friends or family that want to, watch her presentation, or colleagues specifically at work that are interested, please, give us a couple of days and we will post this online. Thank you once again. If you guys do have any questions or concerns about, the program or anything about that, feel free to reach out to myself, anybody in the admissions department, and we will happily answer any and all of your questions. But I think we're gonna wrap it up here and let Ms. Jacqueline go for the evening, as I'm sure she's got a lot of other work to do with her research continuing. So thank you all once again for showing up this evening. It's been a pleasure. Our email is in the chat right now. Please feel free to take that down and reach out to us at any time, and we will happily answer any of your guys' questions about things going forward. All right. I hope you all have a wonderful evening. Thank you very much, and we will look forward to speaking to you again soon. Take care, guys.
Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity.